Today we're going to talk about using Aperture Priority mode in your landscape photography. There's always a lot of videos and things out there telling you to use manual mode for your landscape photography, and that's how you're going to get the best result. And knowing how to use manual mode is a great skill and a great direction to move and an expertise to obtain. Knowing how the exposure triangle works and how your shutter speed influences it and your aperture and ISO are all very important things. And ultimately, mastering manual mode will make your photography easier because you'll really understand how those exposure triangle elements play with each other. However, as today's cameras get smarter and smarter and more powerful, they're able to do things that maybe several years ago we couldn't count on as much. And some of those things that it can do are semi-automatic modes. So things like aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode. Today we're going to talk about aperture priority mode because it's actually a pretty good fit for landscape photography and can make your life just a little easier while you're out there photographing. So aperture priority mode is a semi-automatic mode on your camera where you choose your aperture and the camera takes care of the rest. So in landscape photography, we're pretty concerned about depth of field, making sure we have everything in focus from the front of the scene to the back of the scene. So a lot of times we end up with apertures of like f8 to f16, something in that range. In aperture priority mode, you would choose your aperture and your camera would start figuring out the rest of the exposure with some minor tweaks by us through some things like exposure compensation. If you want the camera to make all of the rest of the decisions, then you would leave your camera in like auto ISO mode, and then when you choose your aperture, the camera would use your ISO. It would automatically choose your ISO, choose your shutter speed to get the exposure you want. I would highly recommend setting your ISO as well, so that way the only real decisions being made is your shutter speed. So what I do when I'm shooting in aperture priority mode is I have my ISO set for landscape photography, typically, ISO 64, ISO 100. I choose my aperture of say f8, and now my camera is going to figure out what my shutter speed could be. If I'm in dark conditions, it's going to set it to be a pretty slow shutter speed, but because I'm most often shooting on a tripod in those conditions, it really doesn't matter because I've got the stable piece figured out. If I'm shooting in a brighter condition, it's going to speed the shutter up, but I can focus on choosing the correct aperture for the scene to get the look I want and let the camera handle the rest. So that leaves me with, my ISO set to 100, choose my aperture, camera figures out the shutter speed. Now, one, that just makes things easy. If I'm moving around the woods like I'm going to be doing today, the light's going to be fairly consistent. There's going to be some bright spots here and there as the sun comes a little higher in the sky and depending on the tree cover. But I can choose my aperture and I don't have to think a whole lot about shutter speed. I'll be on a tripod, just let my camera figure it out. If it goes slow, I'm on a tripod nice and stable. If it goes fast, then there's no problem at all. Now, why that can be an advantage is if I'm set up at a scene and watching it for a while and the sun goes behind a cloud, my camera will automatically adjust that shutter speed for the reduction in light. I don't have to watch it or do anything like that, which is pretty handy because I can focus on composing my scene, choosing my aperture, and let the camera handle the rest. And those changing light conditions will help handle that. Another situation where aperture priority mode can be handy is like a sunrise or a sunset. The light starts changing rapidly, and you can take the time, put it in aperture priority mode, get your exposure set just the way you want, and as the light changes, your camera is going to adjust that shutter speed on the fly to help keep your exposures consistent across that sunrise or sunset. Which can be pretty handy. You don't have to fiddle as much with the shutter speed, you don't have to make all those frequent adjustments, you can just sort of let your camera do the work. So aperture priority mode is a great way to get out there and practice your landscape photography while either you're getting up to speed on manual mode, or just even if you're an expert at manual mode, aperture priority can just let you focus on some other things like the composition and the framing of the image as opposed to camera settings. So we're out here this morning in the woods and we're going to just walk one of these trails. We're going to look for some interesting woodland compositions. I'm going to be using aperture priority mode on my camera, and we'll take a look at the back of the camera and we'll sort of talk through how I'm using aperture priority mode and maybe some exposure compensation to get that slight tweak, and we'll talk a little bit more about the advantages of using aperture priority mode. Okay, so I found this neat little spot along the trail. There's a big pond of water right here on my left. We've got the trees hanging over the trail going ahead with a slight bend in it. So I'm just gonna sit here, play a little bit. I'm gonna be in aperture priority mode. We'll take a look at the back of the camera as I work through some of these settings, and we'll use the histogram to make sure we get a good exposure. And the key with the aperture priority here is once I get it locked in, even if the light changes a little bit here, things like that, my camera automatically compensates so I can focus on making sure am I getting the reflection that I want. Just makes it really easy to do, a little bit less work than manual mode, and you still get great results. Okay, so we got our scene up here in front of us. We got the water over here to the left of the screen. This trail runs off up through here. Nice dark greens, nice saturated greens. Not using a polarizing filter right now, and I am in aperture priority mode. I set my aperture to f8. I have my ISO set to 100, so the camera's making the decisions on the shutter speed. What I'm looking at right here is I have the histogram, and I'm bumping pretty strong right up there against there. I get a little bit of sky. The way to change this is I'm gonna use exposure compensation mode, which is a little button on the Nikon, some have dials, and I'm gonna reduce the exposure a touch, -1/3, and you can see what it's doing is it's making that shutter speed faster, and I'm starting to bring the histogram over. So let's go back to 0. So look at this, I'm bumping up over here. The shutter speed my camera has chosen is 1/3, and the scene's just a little bright. Histogram's bumping pretty far up here over here on the right. I'm going to take exposure compensation. I'm going to say don't expose this quite as much. Boom, I dropped that right side a little bit more. I'm going to drop it just a touch more. Now I've got just a little bit of bump over here, which I'm pretty sure I can pull back in the raw file. My aperture's still f8, my ISO's still 100, but my shutter speed went to 1/5. Sped the shutter up to reduce the light. So now my exposure is set. Even if the sun comes out brighter or the clouds change, as the lighting conditions change, my camera's going to automatically do what it takes to keep this exposure and this histogram, which I consider well exposed. It'll maintain my aperture and ISO, and it'll change that shutter speed to keep the exposure I want. Now I'm on a tripod, so I don't care how slow that shutter speed goes because I'm stable. I don't need to worry about that. Let's go ahead and get some shots here, and we'll go from there. I'll throw the self timer on here real fast. I use a 5-second self timer. I do that as opposed to like just a shutter release. It just keeps less equipment out in the field, so I sort of like the self timer. Cool, so I like that. So again, the advantage here is I could walk away, do something with my camera bag, eat a snack, come back, and no matter what's happened to the light, my camera is going to maintain this exposure I've set. So I put the effort into setting this exposure, and once it's set, now I can focus on composition, and because even as the light change, my camera knows what I think the good exposure is based on the histogram, and it's going to keep f8, keep the ISO, and I'll just change that shutter speed to get what I want. Pretty handy. So you still use your histogram, you still use what you know about the exposure triangle, just you can focus on getting that exposure you want, set it, and more or less forget it while you work on the scene. So one thing I did there while I was setting that exposure was I did use exposure compensation, and that is something that when you're using aperture priority mode just gets a little different, but that's how you tweak what your camera thinks it should be. So your camera's automatically trying to figure out that shutter speed, but we all know the camera's not always perfect. So you can use exposure compensation to tell your camera, well, actually I want that a little less exposed, or I want it a little more exposed. So in that situation, I had some bright highlights. Camera thought I was doing good, but because of those highlights up in the trees that I was catching, it was sort of gonna overexpose those pieces. So I needed to tell the camera through exposure compensation, let's knock 2/3 of a stop off of that so I got the exposure that I wanted. So I'm here in the woods where the light is really fairly consistent. There's little spots of bright light, that I'm in the shade, things like that. So my camera now knows what I thought was a good exposure for this. So now if I move around, it knows sort of what I want the exposure is. The lighting's very similar. So if I take the camera and I say randomly point off this way, it changes my shutter speed to 1/13, keeps my f8, keeps my ISO 100. My histogram is still just bumping right up there like that, just like it was in my other scene. And I didn't have to change anything on the camera. So the camera is sort of knowing what I want my exposure to be in this particular area. I can sort of move around to several different spots, and my camera's just gonna come in real close, if not exactly what I want exposure-wise. And it's just gonna take care of the shutter speed. And what that does is it frees up my time and my headspace to think about my compositions and less about camera settings. It can also be a good way to help move quickly. Say I was short on time and only had half an hour in this area or something like that. Get my things, all my exposure dialed in through aperture priority mode, and anything I work through here, again, the focus can be on composition at less than on exposure because the camera sort of knows what I want. Now you might get a slightly different area, super bright spot, where you have to tweak that exposure compensation some, but once you get it set, anything you do in that area should work out pretty well. So it's a pretty handy mode to know. Okay, so I've moved over here and I got these little wildflowers just off to the side of the trail. It's a much more zoomed in shot, much closer shot, and I don't have as much bright light in the background. So My exposure compensation I had before, I had the scene with little bits of bright, a wider shot, is not quite right. It's a little underexposed because I've told exposure compensation to drop me down by about 2/3 of a stop. So we're going to tweak exposure compensation and bring it up, use the histogram like we've gone over before to get that exposure right. And then as I work on other flowers and compositions in this area, as the lightness and darkness changes, the camera's going to take care of my shutter speed so I can focus on those compositions. Let's take a look. Okay, so here we are where I moved over to the flowers and things. Okay, so if we look at the back of the camera here, you can see I'm underexposed and I haven't changed anything. I'm still sitting at a 2/3 stop under due to exposure compensation from my previous scenes. So the histogram's way over here to the left. I don't have as much light in here. As you can see, I just got the flowers with a dark green background. So to fix that, I keep everything I want because I want my f8, I want my ISO 100, use my exposure compensation. I'm gonna bring it to 0. And you can see that moved the histogram over, but I'm still not over to the right like I want to be, like I've gone over in other videos. So what we're going to do is we're going to take exposure compensation. I'm going to say overexpose this image 1/3 of a stop. And see the histogram moved over. I think I can go a little bit more. Bump it over again. Now we're starting to get into there, not bumping up against the right. Try one more. I can probably pull that off because I'm not bumping up against the right side of the histogram or anything like that. So in this scene, what I've done is still aperture priority mode. It's got my f8, ISO 100. So this gets me to just about where I want to be. Histogram's looking good. It's a little over to the right. Should have lots of detail in this image. So yeah, so after those adjustments, I'm at +1 exposure compensation, telling the camera to make the whole scene brighter so that it plays with my shutter speed. So that's what that exposure compensation does, is my scene was a little underlit. I've moved over here with a -2/3 of a stop from my previous area. I set it to 0 so that I could see what the camera really wanted, and it was still a little dark based on the histogram. The histogram said I could use some more exposure. So then I used exposure compensation to bump it up. Now the advantage is any of the little flowers I shoot over here as I work through my composition should be really close to that exposure without me having to make any shutter speed adjustments or anything like that because the camera's going to take care of it. So it's a real quick, handy way to work once you get in an area, set your exposure, and you can sort of work around your compositions, focus on that instead of your exposure. And just to prove that point, I have moved same sort of flower arrangement, but I've switched sides on it and things like that. Kept everything the same, aperture priority mode, kept my f8, my ISO 100, kept my exposure compensation at +1, but because I'm in the same spot, my camera is figuring it out. It is right over to the edge of the histogram, which is where I wanted it, and my shutter speed has now gone to 1/2.5, so it has made compensations to the shutter speed in order to get the exposure I want on this arrangement. Now, I don't think this is a great composition over here. I'm gonna go ahead and take the shot, but it just shows how useful. It allows me to focus on how do I want to compose these. I can move around, and the camera's semi-automatic mode is taking care of the exposure, letting me keep my mind on composition. So aperture priority mode for landscape photography is a great mode. It can really let you focus on your compositions and other things than just the camera settings. It helps to fully understand the exposure triangle so that you know what it's doing. That foundation knowledge is important, but aperture priority mode can just sort of make your job out in the field a little easier. So I am a fan of aperture priority mode in some conditions. It's not perfect all the time. Situations where I myself would not use aperture priority mode is when I'm photographing waterfalls or when I have lots of motion in my scene. So for example, some blowing prairie grasses, some trees where I'm getting more of the leaves as the wind comes through, because there I want to be more conscious of my shutter speed to make sure I'm freezing the action. Now you can use ISO to influence your shutter speed. So say for example, I want a faster shutter speed and I'm shooting at f8 ISO 100. If I move my ISO up to say ISO 400, ISO 800, my shutter speed will get faster because I'm making the camera more sensitive to light, so it'll speed that shutter speed up. So that works, and people that swear by aperture priority mode, you know, that's how they sort of work around that and deal with that. In my mind, once I start having to change more things than just exposure compensation, I tend to want to fall back to manual mode, because then I can change exactly what I want. To me, it's a little more intuitive if I'm trying to control my shutter speed for the movement of a waterfall, to think about it in terms of shutter speed and knowing exactly what I'm changing it to, as opposed to ISO and hoping I get it in ballpark of what I want. It's really, you're changing settings either way, just more intuitive to me at that point in manual mode. But other than that, like I said, days out like this, woodlands, aperture priority mode is great. Keeps things simple, frees your mind up, lets the camera do some of the heavy lifting, some of the thinking. It does a pretty good job at that. So, you know, I sort of let it do its thing. Works great for when you're in a hurry, or, you know, if it's not a super complex lighting situation. When there's movement, I tend to fall back into manual mode. But if you really get into Aperture Priority, you can learn how to make those ISO adjustments to get what you want and still shoot Aperture Priority. So it's pretty versatile and just something to consider when you're out practicing your landscape photography. So if you like today's video, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see more landscape photography content from me in the future, like mini gear reviews, behind the scenes, tips and tricks like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future landscape photography content from me. And thank you for watching.